Thanks very much, Gloria, for the kind introduction and for inviting me to speak today, and for all of you for coming. So over 70 years have now passed since the end of World War II, and 2 generations or so have been born who have never experienced the war. But despite this passage of time, in Japan, the war and questions about how it should be remembered are still very much alive. They're politically contentious, both within Japan and in Japan's relationships with its neighbors, especially its East Asian neighbors, South Korea and China. And questions about who and how and where to remember the war are debated very publicly and heatedly. So this is what I'll be talking about today, which is not so much the war itself, but how it has been remembered in Japan since 1945. So there's some enduring questions that have made the issue of war memory very difficult and complicated in Japan. One of them is, what do you tell the dead when you lose? And this was more of an immediate question in the years just after the war. But when you lose a war, what do you tell people? For what did they sacrifice their lives? And what do you say to those who lived, who lost loved ones, or who endured years of war, who struggled with starvation, and all for reasons that were shown ultimately to be mistaken in a war that proved to be unwinnable? So that's one question. Another question is, how do you mourn the dead? And how do you mourn the dead when some of those dead did atrocious things in the course of that war? And another issue is, how should Japan as a country reconstruct a sense of national identity, even a kind of healthy sense of national pride, when that core of what used to constitute national identity, imperialism, empire, the emperor, when all that was delegitimized by the war and by defeat in the war, and when nationalism in its previous pre-war and wartime incarnation turned out to have such disastrous consequences. So how do you then, after the war, have a kind of sense of national identity? And what should the tenets of that national identity be? So these are the kinds of questions that we'll be examining, that have been grappled with in post-war Japan. And just a note about that, when I say post-war Japan, I'm really talking about the period from 1945, arguably all the way up until the present. There have been moments since 1945 when the Japanese government will come out and say, okay, the post-war period is now over. The government did this in the mid-1950s when the economy started to turn around. It came out with this report that said, okay, the post-war is now over. But people still refer to that period as the post-war. In 1989, when the emperor from the wartime period, Emperor Hirohito, died, then people were like, okay, now the post-war is really over. But then people still continue to call it the post-war. And in part because there has not been another catastrophic event on the scale of World War. There has been nothing to kind of mark the end of the post-war, such as I think we can say that Japan in any case is still in the post-war. So when I say post-war, I'm talking about kind of 1945 all the way through to the present. All right. So starting in 1945, August 15th of 1945, on this day, Emperor Hirohito announced to his people Japan's surrender in World War II. And we have a little audio clip. Okay, I think we can. So his voice would have been unfamiliar to most people who were listening to the radio broadcast. They wouldn't have heard it during the war. His public appearances during the war were really rare. So the fact that he would come out and that people would hear his voice was a big deal. His language was formal and stilted, so much so that I guess that most young Japanese people today wouldn't have understood what we heard just now either. And also, this announcement of the surrender was the first attempt to frame the war in hindsight, to try to express in this moment of defeat how to think about the war now past. And the rescript kind of captured this transitional moment. And the kind of question here, right, is if you are the emperor on August 15th, 1945, what is it that you say to your people about why you're surrendering and why this war was fought? And so if we look at the images here, the one on the left is of people listening to the radio address, although there's some speculation now that this was staged after the fact. On the right is the text of the rescript on surrender. And so at this moment on August 15th, 1945, if we look at the actual content of what was said, there's something of a kind of defensive strain to the rescript, a kind of attempt to justify the war just fought. So if we look at part of it, we declared war on American Britain out of our sincere desire to secure Japan's self-preservation and the stabilization of East Asia, it being far from our thought either to infringe upon the sovereignty of other nations or to embark upon territorial aggrandizement. Now, so here we have a kind of defense, a justification of self-preservation, stabilization of East Asia. We have also a kind of complete paving over of a history of imperialism and colonialism with this language of kind of, not infringing upon the sovereignty of other nations. So this is the kind of way in which the war was being framed at this moment. There was also kind of rewriting of the history of colonialism, Japanese colonialism in East Asia. We cannot but express the deepest sense of regret to our allied nations of East Asia who have consistently cooperated with the empire towards the emancipation of East Asia. This cooperation was not voluntary. It paves over the history of Japanese colonialism in South Korea, in Korea, in relations with China, etc. Also, this language of the kind of emancipation of East Asia, or the emancipation of Asia, is also putting a gloss on this history, clearly. I mean, there was a phase early on where there were some countries in Asia who saw Japan as a kind of liberating force, from Western imperialism and colonialism, but the kind of falseness of that was pretty quickly revealed. So here we have a kind of whitewashing of colonialism, Japan's colonial past. There's also an explanation of surrender, right? You have to explain why are we surrendering now after years of fighting. The war situation has developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage, while the general trends of the world have all turned against her interest. Moreover, the enemy has begun to employ a new and most cruel bomb, the power of which to do damage is indeed incalculable, taking the toll of many innocent lives. Should we continue to fight, it would not only result in an ultimate collapse and obliteration of the Japanese nation, but also it would lead to the total extinction of human civilization. So here you have this kind of sense of Japan being subject to forces beyond its control, of everything kind of turning against the country. There's a pointing to the atomic bombings, and indeed, for those who justified the use of the bomb at the time in 1945, this was one of the reasons, which was saying it would give Japan a kind of reason, an excuse to surrender. So we do see that language here. And also this idea of, well, we're surrendering not just for the sake of the nation, but for the well-being of human civilization. Right? So this was how it was kind of being framed. So if we think about the kind of themes in the rescript of surrender, there's no expression of responsibility. There's no sense of responsibility for having started the war, for why the U.S. thought it necessary to use the atomic bombs, for colonialism. And again, another theme is this sense of forces beyond Japan's control, that the war was something that was done to Japan. And in some ways, if we think about this moment, this framing makes sense. It's difficult at this moment of surrender for the emperor to say that the defeat had delegitimized all of the reasons for fighting the war, that the country had done things for which it needed to atone, and that lives might have been lost for nothing. That would have been difficult to say. There were also in the rescript hints of what the post-war was to look like. So, one line, we've resolved to pave the way for grand peace for all the generations to come. And in fact, this idea of kind of Japan embracing and embodying pacifism is an idea that persists long into the post-war, arguably to the present day. And the very last line of the rescript was that Japan should keep pace with the progress of the world, which, as it would play out, would mean, economic growth, democratization, etc. Although this is only kind of hinted about this. So this was the earliest narrative about the war, written amidst the kind of disoriented chaos of its end. Then, in this kind of earliest phase of trying to make sense of the war, in the kind of weeks and months after this, what shaped the contours of how the war was remembered, of war memory, perhaps the most, was Japan's occupation by the United States from 1945 to 1952. And this was an occupation that ultimately lasted longer than the war between the US and Japan. That image, the photograph on the right, is the famous one of General MacArthur with Emperor Hirohito there standing side by side. Now, if we look at the occupation, at this historical moment, the US was mainly concerned about the developing Cold War, and so wanted to resuscitate Japan to make it a bulwark against communism in East Asia. So the US then had every interest to dispense with the issue of war responsibility as quickly as possible, and not to hold all Japanese people responsible for the war. So blame was placed mainly on the kind of militarists and leaders of wartime Japan. So the kind of occupation's understanding narrative of the war was that the Japanese people had been manipulated and misled by their leaders in the road to war, and that then the country could be rehabilitated if those leaders were removed. All right, so if you just kind of take those leaders away, things would be okay and back on course. So to this end, the occupation carried out purges in the early years of the occupation from 45 to 48, purged about 200,000 men from positions in the government, financial world, etc., who were judged responsible for leading the war effort. There was also an extensive censorship apparatus to the occupation, which controlled expression in various ways about what could be said about the war and about the occupiers. So nothing could be said that would be in danger of kind of kindling wartime passions. That's understandable. No criticism of pre-war policies of the Allies. No statements about the global context in which Japan's leaders embarked on the war. Those were all not allowed. Now, when it came to writings about the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, writing about that experience was not explicitly prescribed, but writings were suppressed and severely cut. And that was even more true of the visual record of documentaries, documentary footage, even more so than of writing. So the atomic bombings quickly came to be understood as a kind of taboo subject. So there was a combination of some outright censorship and also pretty widespread self-censorship when it came to writing about the atomic bombings. There was also overt censorship of scientific writings about the atomic bombings. So any reports concerning the effects of the blasts and radiation could not be made public until the very end, the kind of closing months of the occupation. There also could not be any criticism of the war crimes trials that the Allies carried out. So we'll talk about the Tokyo war crimes trial. So what's usually known as the Tokyo war crimes trial, that's the short version for what's called the International Military Tribunal for the Far East. It was carried out from May of 1946 through 1948. This was a kind of trial for the top leaders, what the kind of worst war criminals. They're called the Class A war criminals. There were a lot of other trials that happened after the war, but not in Japan proper, a lot in the kind of former colonies of the empire for Class B, Class C war criminals. But this was the kind of, if you could think of it as a kind of equivalent to the Nuremberg trials in the European context. There were 11 justices, 7 former leaders were executed, 16 sentenced to life imprisonment. And in a sign that pragmatism sometimes trumped a sense of accountability, Emperor Hirohito was not tried because the US occupation forces feared that this would be too upsetting to Japanese people and therefore destabilizing to the occupation. And as a result, then, Emperor Hirohito remained emperor until 1989. And as a side note, as a historian, I'd say we also, as historians, we still don't know as much as we could or should about the emperor's wartime role because he didn't have to produce any documentation or answer any questions in the aftermath of the war because he wasn't tried. And from the perspective of the Japanese public, the interest was more with the verdicts than with the proceedings themselves. The proceedings seemed to go on forever, such that people kind of lost interest in them. There were 818 court sessions over 417 days, not to mention that most people were very much consumed by dealing with the kind of difficulties of day-to-day life, starvation, etc. So most people were not following the trial closely over this period of time, but they were concerned about the verdicts. And although ultimately, the trial underscored this idea of the leaders being responsible for the war, because it was the leaders who were being tried, there were decisions made in the course of the trial and problems with the trial that in later years, decades later, would be used by the right wing in Japan and kind of war crimes deniers in Japan to undercut the trial's legitimacy. So, for example, one of the crimes for which people were tried was conspiracy to wage aggressive war. And some people looked at that then and have since to say, well, that seems like the epitome of victor's justice. It only seems like a conspiracy to wage war if you've lost that war. If one has waged that war but won that war, that would not be something that would be considered a crime, some said. There were also certain crimes against humanity, for example, that did not exist in international law at the time that the crimes were committed. So this was a kind of ex post facto law. There was no Japanese justice among the 11 justices. For that matter, there was no Korean justice among the 11 justices. So there are various things that in later years, and I'll talk about this in a bit, that kind of served as fodder for right-wing people, especially later, to kind of to point to what they see as the trial's illegitimacy. But nonetheless, the war crimes trial kind of underscored this understanding, this narrative of the leaders being most responsible for the war. And so a legacy in terms of war memory for the occupation really as a whole was that most Japanese people were more angry at their own wartime government, felt deceived by their own leaders more than they were upset with the US as a former enemy. And that was true even when it came to the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Blame was not really placed on the US for the dropping of the bombs, nor even necessarily in Japan for starting the war. Rather, it was kind of placed more on this idea of kind of the inhumanity of war in general. And so coming out of the occupation, the US was clearly no longer a wartime enemy, but had transitioned into being a Cold War ally. Right, so that's the occupation years. Then the next phase of war memory emerged in the 1950s, really in the kind of last years of the occupation and then well into the next decade. And the 1950s and really into the early 1960s, this was a period when there was a lot of reflection about grief and loss and the hardships of war. And in some ways, this was a kind of an emotional outpouring of what had been held in and couldn't be expressed under the occupation. So there was a prevailing sense that war in general, and not specific institutions or specific people, was to blame, and that people were victims of war, of circumstance, and of forces beyond their control. So So there were many novels written and films made during the 1950s on this theme, about the kind of inhumanity of war. So one of them was called Fires on the Plain, which is a novel published in 1952, written by Oka Shohei, who himself had been a soldier in the Imperial Japanese Army. His novel was later turned into a film. This is a still from the film here in 1959. And the novel and the film's about a Japanese private serving in the Philippines. And it's really the kind of story of his loss of innocence, his struggles with his own morality, and descent into madness. There was also a film trilogy called The Human Condition that came out from between 1959 and 1961, which was based on a 6-volume novel from the mid-1950s. We'll play a short clip from the film. Michiko's his wife. So you get a sense there of this, again, this kind of this theme of moral struggle. In this film, the protagonist who we saw here was a pacifist who kind of attempted to fight the oppressiveness of military institutions and war. So the scene from the left is from early on in the trilogy, where he's working at a labor camp where they're forced Chinese labor, and kind of his struggles with the very poor way in which the laborers are treated. And then by the end of the trilogy, it's a shot on the right there, which again is this kind of descent into his own madness caused by kind of immorality of war. So, you know, these films too, like Fires on the Plain, were about, you know, the pointlessness of war, about madness, about death. And this idea of war as something that was done to people was also echoed in memories about the atomic bombings. So the atomic bombings, the experience was translated into a sense that Japan had a unique responsibility because of the atomic bombings to assume an anti-nuclear stance and to embrace peace. So the kind of narrative here was, as the only country to have experienced nuclear bombings, we have a unique responsibility to take an anti-nuclear stance and to embrace peace. So when the museum and the memorial to the atomic bombings was opened in Hiroshima in 1955, there was a lot of attention given to the inscription on the central kind of stone memorial. So here's the central part of the memorial. You can see through the memorial to the famous dome in the back. And then in that kind of square here is an inscription that in translation, I'll give you the English translation, is, "Please rest in peace, for we shall not repeat the mistake." Except in the original Japanese, there is no we, there's no subject, which is not unusual in Japanese language. So in translation, that kind of we is inserted, but there's a lot of kind of ambiguity to this line. First of all, there is no subject in the original Japanese, but even if we insert the we there, who is the we? Is we Japan? Is we humanity? It's not entirely clear. Also, what's the mistake? Is the mistake the atomic bombings? Is the mistake war? That's also not at all clear either. And so what kind of developed was this universalization of the tragedy of the war and the atomic bombings, and kind of abstractions of the lesson to the war to the level of kind of humanity and peace. But what that meant was that questions about responsibility and accountability then faded into the background. Right, so that's the 50s and early 60s. Then in the kind of third phase, 1970s, early 1980s, that these kind of universalized memories, these kind of themes about the horrors of war and peace, etc., came to be questioned as more information came to the fore and more people were willing to raise questions about Japan's wartime atrocities. So in 1970, there was a Korean memorial that was erected to Korean victims of the atomic bombings at the Hiroshima Peace Memorial Park. And what this did was that it complicated that kind of story of we Japanese are unique for having experienced this because it's not just Japanese people who were victims, there were Koreans there as well. And then that raises the question, why were there Koreans in Hiroshima? The answer in most cases is because they were forced labor brought over from colonial Korea to work in factories on mainland Japan. And so what this memorial did was it reminded people that these narratives, one about Japan as victim of the atomic bombings and one of Japan as victimizer, colonial victimizer, were not separate, that they were linked. So that kind of complicated things, this memorial. There was also, in the 1970s, a lot more journalistic coverage of what's usually called the Nanjing Massacre, which is a kind of term for Japan's violent entry into and taking of Nanjing in China in December of 1937. It's called different things by different people, which we'll return to in a second. Those who kind of downplay its horrors call it merely the Nanjing incident. Nanjing massacre is usually more conventional than that. But there started to be more information about the Nanjing massacre. There was one journalist in particular named Honda Katsuichi who started to write articles and books about the Nanjing massacre. And also in 1973, the first history textbook that talked about the Nanjing massacre was published and used. And on the subject of history textbooks, textbooks started to get a lot of attention in the 1970s, in part because in 1974 there was a ruling by the Tokyo District Court on a case about textbook screening, which was brought by this man who's a historian, Ienaga Saburo. And so the way that kind of history textbook screening worked, starting in the late 1940s or so, was that the Ministry of Education screened history textbooks and chose a few that could be used in the classroom. So unlike the US, where those decisions tend to be more kind of local level, those are made more at the federal level in Japan. And what that means is that history textbooks are seen then as a more kind of official government narrative of history, in this case of the war. And that puts a lot of pressure on that narrative. And what Ienaga Saburo objected to is that he had been writing textbooks since the 1950s, and he grew frustrated and upset with his experience of the process in which changes were recommended to him, certain rejections to what he had written, led him to believe that the textbook screening process constituted censorship and was unconstitutional. So the case that he brought was to have the textbook screening process be deemed unconstitutional. Now in this 1974 case, the screening process was deemed constitutional, wasn't deemed unconstitutional. But it found that the government had abused, kind of overextended its review process in certain instances. And so Ienaga was awarded a kind of modest sum in damages. These cases would continue, Ienaga's cases would continue into the 1990s. In no case was the screening process found unconstitutional, but there were various instances of kind of overreach. Now, while not successful on the legal front in the sense that Ienaga didn't kind of see what he wanted in terms of the screening process being deemed unconstitutional, these cases did bring a lot of attention to history textbooks and raised lots of questions about the official narratives about the war, and also who gets to decide on the narrative? Who gets to decide what the history is that's told? And is there any responsibility in the writing of those history textbooks to the views of and narratives of other countries? And that is an issue that came up in this textbook controversy in 1982, which was the first textbook controversy that extended beyond Japan and became an international issue. So what happened in 1982 was that there were news reports that the Ministry of Education had requested a change in the wording to describe Japan's actions in Northeast China, to change it from shinryaku, which means invasion, to shinshitsu, or advance, to kind of change the description of that from invasion to advance. And so there were protests in China and South Korea that this was a kind of downplaying of Japan's military actions in China. So there was an uproar in China and South Korea about this. Now it turns out that this was not a real story, that the Ministry of Education had not recommended this change, but it turned into this huge kind of political diplomatic row in 1982, and there have been many like this since. So textbooks became this kind of heated international issue. Also in the 1970s, 1980s, there was much more attention to Unit 731, which was a biological warfare unit in northern China. And so there was a lot more about Unit 731 that came out. There was also a lot more about the U.S. role in covering up Unit 731 that came out in the 1970s. Because what happened with Unit 731 was that a lot of the top leaders were not tried as part of the Tokyo war crimes trials. Because the U.S. cut a deal that if the U.S. got the information from the biological warfare experiments, which were done, many of which were done on live human subjects, that the leaders of Unit 731 wouldn't be tried. So both what happened at Unit 731 and the kind of role of the U.S. in the cover-up was exposed in the 1970s. All right, then the next phase, kind of late 1980s and early 1990s, was a real watershed in terms of opening the floodgates for discussion and debate about the war. And this for several reasons. One was that Emperor Hirohito died in 1989, so that there were some people who felt like they couldn't really say what they wanted to about the war until Hirohito died. And then it became kind of fair game to say a lot of critical things. Also, the end of the Cold War meant that the kind of relationship with the U.S. was loosened a little bit. Kind of Cold War influence on narratives also loosened a little bit. So you've got this kind of flood of discussion, debate about the war. One of the points of this was that there was kind of first public testimony about comfort women and the comfort women system in 1991. And the comfort women kind of being a euphemism to talk about women who were recruited into kind of sexual service of Japanese soldiers during the war. So a lot more information and a lot more comfort women themselves coming forward in the 1990s. There was also another controversy about textbooks. This one about this textbook titled Atarashi Rekishi Kyokasho, the new history textbook, which took a very kind of right-wing approach on this history, downplaying of Japanese atrocities. And this created a lot of domestic and international controversy. Now, this textbook ultimately was not very widely used. There were maybe kind of less than a handful of junior high schools that used it. But what was upsetting to people was that the Ministry of Education approved it. And again, that's kind of seen as this official stamp of approval on this narrative about the war. So that was very upsetting. Another kind of controversy was about this book, with which you might be familiar, written by the Chinese-American writer Iris Chang, titled The Rape of Nanking. So the title, for one, was controversial. I'd mentioned that Nanjing Incident and Nanjing Massacre are two ways of talking about it. The intentional decision to call it the rape of Nanking was very provocative. And the subtitle, which you can't see here, is The Forgotten Holocaust of World War II. So her use of the term Holocaust, or evocation of the Holocaust, was also very controversial. And it sparked a lot of debate. It got a lot of pushback, especially from more kind of right-wing groups in Japan. One of the points of contention was the figure that she gave for the number of people who were killed in Nanjing. This is a kind of hang-up for everyone. Was it 300,000 or was it 50,000? And so there's kind of debates about that. There was also debates about the ways in which she cropped some of her photographs. And so for right-wing groups, they latched onto what they saw as what might otherwise be seen as a couple of discrepancies or small points to kind of delegitimize the book as a whole, and kind of, as a kind of fuel for denying that the massacre had taken place at all. Also in this time period, there's a formation of conservative groups, like what was called the Liberal View of History Study Group, not at all actually liberal, but these kind of right-wing groups, which had what could be called the kind of Greater East Asian War view. So what they tend to talk about the war and call the war the Greater East Asia Wars. It's very right-wing terminology for the war. That kind of references kind of Japan's attempt to build this Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere during the wartime period. These right-wing groups tend to prefer this language of the Greater East Asia War to the more standard, Pacific War, World War II. This is a kind of group that pointed out the flaws, what it saw as the flaws of the Tokyo trials. They're the critics of what they see as the kind of Tokyo trial view of history. And one of the people who belonged to this liberal view of history study group was a comic book artist by the name of Kobayashi Yoshinori. And he came out with a series of manga, which we can translate as comic books or graphic novels. It's such a kind of diverse genre. But he came out with a series of books in the late 90s, early 2000s about the war. You might notice that on this particular page, he's taking issue with Iris Chang's book here. Goes on to explain how he thinks that the photographs are doctored and how she's kind of exaggerated the killings that happened in Nanjing. I happen to have a copy of the manga here, just to give you a sense of it, just the kind of the size of it, and a lot of it is just the kind of his take on the war. It's sold very well. Although it's sometimes hard to get a sense of what sales figures mean. I apparently bought this as well. But doesn't necessarily mean you subscribe to its politics, but it sold very well. And it was actually quite popular among a younger generation that had not experienced the war. And in some ways, I think what we saw there was that there started to be a generation that actually did learn about Japanese wartime atrocities in the classroom. And in the classroom from what were really mainly left-leaning teachers. And so there's a way in which the kind of appeal of a book like this is a kind of reaction against that. And a lot of what Kobayashi wrote about was, well, how is Japan supposed to have any sense of national identity if all we're taught is all the bad things that Japan did during the war? So it's the kind of nationalistic take on the war. But again, also criticism of this too when it came out. All right, so all of these issues, so that takes us to the kind of early 1990s, all of these issues continue to be debated through to the present. But we can touch on a couple that have been particularly heated in the present and with which you might be familiar because they kind of pop up periodically in American journalistic coverage. One of them has to do with Yasukuni Shrine in Tokyo. The first image on my first slide was of the actual shrine. So Yasukuni Shrine it's a shrine that was founded in the 1860s, basically to memorialize those who had died in a civil war that had just taken place in the 1860s. The shrine actually assumed the name Yasukuni in the 1870s and was granted the status of a kind of special state-funded shrine. But during the occupation period, the shrine was kind of ripped of this special status and any association with the state, and it became what was called an independent religious juridical person, which just means that it's not connected to the state in any way. Now, the reason why Yasukuni Shrine has become controversial is because in 1978, the shrine decided to enshrine Class A war criminals. So not just all those who had lost their lives, whose souls are thought to be enshrined here, but made it a point of saying we are also enshrining the Class A war criminals. And so what that means is that if a head of state goes to Yasukuni Shrine and pays respects to the war dead, they are then also paying respects to these convicted Class A war criminals. That means that anytime any prime minister, head of state goes to Yasukuni Shrine, there's outcry in places like South Korea and China about Japan having forgotten what it did to its neighbors in East Asia, having forgotten its kind of past of having committed atrocities. So the photograph on the left is of Prime Minister Koizumi Junichiro, who visited Yasukuni in 2001. Koizumi visited the shrine every year that he was in office, a total of 6 times. And the photograph on the right is of protests in the streets in South Korea of Koizumi having visited the shrine. You can kind of see his image there in the background. There were some legal issues. There were cases brought against Koizumi that it was kind of breach of separation of state and religion for him to go, but he continued to go nonetheless. When it comes to Abe Shinzo, so Abe was prime minister once before this current term that he's serving. The first Abe administration was in 2006, 2007. During that time, he did not go to Yasukuni. He just kind of dispatched offerings. But then in this kind of second Abe administration, started in December of 2012, Abe did visit Yasukuni Shrine in 2013, but he hasn't gone as regularly as Koizumi did. Most recently in April of this year, which was the kind of annual spring festival for the shrine, Abe sent ritual offerings but did not himself go to the shrine. It's probably because he did not want to antagonize China, given developments on the Korean Peninsula, concerns about North Korea. So what's the issue, or what are the issues with the Yasukuni Shrine? Some of them have to do with domestic politics. So part of the reason why Koizumi went to the shrine was because he had always been kind of weak with the right-wing flank of his party. So some have thought that he went to the shrine basically to kind of to kind of gain support with that part of his party. There have also been issues about whether a public figure can go to the shrine in a private capacity. So one of the things that Koizumi said is, when I go to the shrine, I'm not going as Prime Minister Koizumi. I'm just going as private individual Koizumi. There are lots of questions about that. Can a public figure like a prime minister actually go to Yasukuni Shrine capacity as a private individual? There are issues of separation of state and religion. There's also the fact that there's no other kind of high-profile place to mourn the war dead. So one of the questions is, well, if there's no kind of equivalent of, say, Arlington Cemetery, if you want to mourn the war dead and pay respects to the war dead, then where are you supposed to do it? And where are you supposed to do it so long as Yasukuni, the shrine, refuses to remove the souls of the convicted war criminals? So that's one complicated set of questions around the issue of especially prime ministerial and cabinet visits to Yasukuni. Another has to do with kind of question of apology. Japan has often been criticized, especially from outside the country, by China and South Korea in particular, that it hasn't truly apologized for its wartime actions. That it isn't, even when it says it's sorry, it isn't truly sorry, that it hasn't repented, say, as Germany has done. But I think it's more complicated than that. Japan has made, for example, financial payments Only 2 of the 48 signatories of the peace treaty reserve their right to demand reparations. Japan has also made payments, significant portions in loan and credit to Burma, Philippines, South Vietnam, Indonesia. It's also expressed in various ways regret, starting in the 50s to Taiwan for the colonialism, for the imperialism in Taiwan. 1965, in its normalization with South Korea, expressed deep regret for the colonial period, also paid considerable sums in grants and aid to South Korean, such that the South Korean government renounced the right to bring any further claims on Japan. Also, expressions of responsibility and reflection to China in 1971, and China decided to forego any reparations payments. And then in the 1990s, there was this kind of series of official apologies that were made. In 1992, Prime Minister Miyazawa officially apologized for the comfort women, treatment of comfort women. Then in 1993, Prime Minister Hosokawa came out and declared the war a mistake, labeled the war a war of aggression. It's worth noting that Hosokawa was the first prime minister in the post-war period who was not from what had been the dominant party, the Liberal Democratic Party, the conservative Liberal Democratic Party. So he came out and declared the war a mistake. In 1995, Prime Minister Murayama expressed deep remorse and heartfelt apology for the war. Murayama was a socialist. He was from the Socialist Democratic Party. Koizumi, an LDP, a Liberal Democratic politician, as most have been in the post-war period, also echoed the same sentiment in 2005. But then also Koizumi went that year to Yasukuni Shrine, so there were mixed messages there. Now you might notice, these kind of 10-year anniversary marks of the end of the war have been very important. 1995, 2005. And so then there were a lot of questions about, well, what was Prime Minister Abe going to say in 2015 on the kind of 70th anniversary of the end of the war? And leading up to that moment, Abe had kind of been suggesting that he was going to back off any language about remorse or regret or apology. There was a lot of concern about this. The statement that he ended up making, that's Abe in the right there, his statement included these lines. On the 70th anniversary of the end of the war, I bow my head deeply before the souls of all those who perished both at home and abroad. I express my feelings of profound grief and my eternal, sincere condolences. There's kind of questions about what condolences mean, whether condolences is the same as apology. There was also a lot of question about whether Abe would apologize for the comfort women system. He stopped short of that. This is one of the lines that he said. We must never forget that there were women behind the battlefields whose honor and dignity were severely injured. No use of the word comfort women, no explicit apology there. He also said, we shall abandon colonial rule forever and respect the right of self-determination of all peoples throughout the world. With deep repentance for the war, Japan made that pledge. Upon it, we have created a free and democratic country, abided by the rule of law, and consistently upheld that pledge never to wage a war again. So he did include that language of deep repentance for the war, but there was also some sense, this kind of, but we're moving ahead, so let's not linger in that past anymore. Look, Japan has become democratic, wealthy, peaceful, etc. Can we now kind of leave that behind and move ahead? So there was a kind of strain of that in his remarks as well. One last quote here from his statement. Japan has repeatedly expressed the feelings of deep remorse and heartfelt apology for its actions during the war. In order to manifest such feelings through concrete actions, we have engraved in our hearts the histories of the suffering of the people in Asia as our neighbors. So lots of discussion is about kind of how to interpret what he said. Also in 2015, there was an agreement reached between the South Korean and Japanese governments on the issue of comfort women. So the Japanese government officially apologized again for the treatment of comfort women, and also offered reparations, kind of $8.3 million to a foundation established by the South Korean government to offer medical, nursing, and other services to the comfort women who are still living, of whom there are about 46 who have come forward at the time. This was an important moment because this is the first time that the Japanese government actually offered funds from the national budget. In the past, any funds that were offered were from private donors. They weren't government funds. So that was that moment in 2015. Except that it was pretty heavily criticized on the South Korean side at the time. There were a number of the comfort women who were still living who said they were going to ignore the agreement, who saw it as a kind of insulting or insufficient. And indeed, there's a lot of kind of debate about especially the kind of idea of paying reparations to comfort women. And the debate, on the one hand, people say, well, you know, the women could benefit from medical support services, etc. There are others who think that the giving of money in particular is a kind of debasement, especially for women who were coerced into providing sexual services, that there's something about giving money for that seems insulting. So there are debates about that. The current South Korean Prime Minister said that they're not accepting the deal for that reason. It's a different government than the one in 2015. The photo from the right is of last week of the newly installed foreign minister on his first or second day, Foreign Minister Kono, who said that he would support implementation of the agreement. So it's kind of unclear now where this is going to go. And the issue here, there are various issues of domestic politics going on. You know, the South Korean Prime Minister who had accepted this agreement was more conservative than the one currently. There are also vested interests in South Korea and China as well about not necessarily resolving issues. That is, that there is a kind of way in which the idea of this past is very much, and holding Japan responsible for this past, is very much a part of Chinese and South Korean national identity in particular, such that there's a kind of vested interest in keeping this issue alive, arguably. All right. So these issues of historical memory are still, as we've seen, very much alive, such that I think they inform conflicts that don't necessarily seem like they're about history or about the war at first glance. So I'll just talk about one case in point quickly. And this has to do with the Senkaku or WWII Islands. Now, you might be hearing in the news all kind of islands disputes that have to do with China. And that kind of islands here and islands in the South China Sea as well. But this one particular island dispute centers around what the Japanese call the Senkaku Islands, what the Chinese call the WWII Islands, and the kind of question is who owns these islands. There are 5 uninhabited islands. The total area is about 2.43 square miles. Not necessarily important land. Now, it has been found that there are probably undersea oil and natural gas fields, but it's not necessarily about that, these islands disputes. In fact, there's an island dispute between Japan and South Korea over what is just this kind of one tiny island. So it's not about the land or even the resources necessarily. Now, the question of who can lay claim to these islands isn't new. They appeared first in the Chinese records in the early 15th century under Chinese names. And then in 1895, they were annexed by Japan and administered as part of Japan's Okinawa prefecture. Then they were placed under US administration in 1945 when Japan lost the war. Then they reverted back to Japanese control in 1972, which is when the US occupation ended in Okinawa prefecture. So just as a side note, the US occupation of most of Japan ended in 1952, but the US remained in Okinawa through 1972. Then there were rumors that the two heads of state of China and Japan talked about the islands in 1972 and agreed at that point that they weren't going to have a whole row about it. it's just a handful of islands, we're not going to care about it. But in the 2000s, it has turned into this kind of flashpoint. So, periodically there's a Chinese fishing vessel that comes close to the islands. More recently, in 2013, China declared a formal air defense identification zone covering airspace over these islands that overlaps with airspace that's claimed by Japan. In May of this year, 4 Chinese Coast Guard ships and a drone aircraft entered territory around the islands, such that in response, Japan scrambled warplanes around the islands. So what is going on here? To some extent, these are about contemporary concerns, right? It's about kind of ascendant China, China kind of staking its claims, expanding its territorial holdings there. But it's also about the importance of kind of symbols. So one of the kind of flashpoints or concerns when it comes to a lot of issues that have to do with Japan, which could be about these islands, or there's been kind of discussion about whether Japan should rewrite its constitution so that it can have a military. Right now it only has self-defense forces. Issues like that touch upon memory of a kind of aggressive Japan from the wartime period. And so kind of rekindle concerns about the kind of idea of a militarily aggressive Japan. And so whether it's about the islands or about Yasukuni Shrine or about anniversaries, there's a lot of symbolic importance that's laden with this history of the war. All right, so where does this leave us? Japanese war memory is, I think, as we've seen, not a simple story of amnesia or victimhood. Especially since the 1970s, there's been a lot of controversy and a lot of debate, even within Japan, about how the war should be remembered. Issues of war memory have arguably become more contentious over the course of the post-war period, which illustrates its changing nature and also the fact that there hasn't been something static that we can just call Japanese war memory. Also, it problematizes the idea of there being some singular Japanese war memory, as if the entire country feels the same way about the war, or as if the government or a single politician somehow represents the country as a whole. That's just not the case. And also, this story illustrates, I think, the very real difficulties of coming to terms with the past. Thank you.